Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Albert. Thank you all for coming and watching this video. I hope you guys enjoy. So I'm going to be talking about the issue of forcing the Medicare for All vote, and there's been a lot of talk on Twitter, and people are having discussions about this, and I wanted to focus on a niche part of this argument, and I'll explain all that. So I think a lot of people are familiar with this, especially if you're like looking for this video or anything like that. But for anyone that's not familiar, basically this all started as like a Twitter exchange. So let me get those screenshots up for you guys. Take a look at right here. So Justin Jackson tweeted at AOC, if AOC and the squad do what Jimmy Dore has suggested, withhold their Medicare for All vote for Pelosi, and then bring the Medicare for All vote to the floor, then they can start a dialogue on Medicare for All. AOC responds about how she has an issue with like this approach, and that kind of ignites this entire discussion. Um, so my focus here is going to be less so about like their exchange, but mainly like this niche argument that came out of that, which was instead of forcing Medicare for All, we should do smaller, more meaningful things that can actually get done right now, like AOC mentioned, $15 minimum wage, and then there's another argument of forcing a vote for the public option, which was Joe Biden's whole healthcare running idea. Um, and if we use the vote for the public option argument and force that vote, then Blue Dog Democrats, Joe Biden have to kind of throw their support around, and that's an easier pass through the House. So that's essentially like this argument that's being made on that. And up until yesterday, like I was on that side of the argument of force a public option instead of Medicare for all. But I did some research and I looked through some stuff, and after reading all the stuff, I ended up changing my mind. So what I'm talking about here is going to be like some of the research that I found and like some of the talking points I saw that ended up giving me like a different perspective on the situation. So the first thing I want to talk about is basically this was like a blog post by Mark Dunlea. So you guys can read about him right here. Basically, it's like some credentials, his education and stuff like that. The post talks about how incrementalists argue that the public opinion polls show overwhelming public support not just for comprehensive universal healthcare financing system, but also for radical reform are misleading. They murmur that it is not politically feasible for our leaders to stand, yet the experience in the various states that have tried incremental approaches objectively shows that it will not work. All right. So off the bat, the point here is that like um and to clarify, this was written in 2008. You guys are going to see a lot of arguments being made here that are still being discussed, right? 12 years ago, arguments that we still make today. And this is part of the reason why like I ended up changing my mind about taking smaller like wins versus forcing like a really heavy issue, is because like we've literally done this before. Like literally we've done this before. Um and you guys are going to see that, I think. So they make the argument here about public opinion, and we have that today, right? Like public opinion support for Medicare for all is pretty massive. um I think the numbers around like 80 something percent for Democrats and like 63 or 69% overall across the board. So that kind of coincides with what we're talking about here at the beginning. Then he goes on to say that, in contrast, the experiences of the rest of the industrial world provide ample evidence that a comprehensive approach to universal healthcare will succeed. Incremental approaches evade the fundamental problems. Real change requires addressing the entire structure. Most of the money spent on healthcare comes from government, federal, and state, yet private health insurance dominates the system. Incremental approaches have done little to nothing to control costs. Hospitals and insurance companies often actually extract more resources as a result, i.e., okay, you can cover more people, but we need to extract higher payments in exchange. And I think this is actually something we see often, and if nothing else, like the example I can give is where like our government is really willing to accept paying like high costs for stuff. Like for example, in the United States, I think I don't have the exact dollar amounts, but I think insulin is like 197 versus like in the UK where it's like 60 something, and in Italy I think it's $19 for insulin. But basically like we pay really high amounts of dollars for the exact same drugs that you can get somewhere else for a much lower cost, right? So that's kind of like what the discussion here is, that we spend a lot of money basically on healthcare. Moving lower, goes on to talk about how most experts admit that a single payer Medicare for All system program does best. Single payer has been rated best by every state that has undertaken the comprehensive cost benefit analysis. Yet many elected officials contend that single payer is not politically feasible. Many argue that massive amounts of money spent by the insurance industry to defeat the Clinton healthcare plan shows that they can't be defeated. However, Clinton explicitly rejected a single payer approach. So, for clarification, like this is talking about Bill Clinton, right? So, again, some context, like historically, right? Way as far back as the 90s, when Bill Clinton was pushing for healthcare reform, right? The exact same feasibility arguments were being made that like we couldn't push for single payer programs. And those arguments were being made when Clinton wasn't even pushing for single payer, right? Um, and then the last point that this makes here is really good. That the lesson arguably is that half-baked, flawed, incremental approaches are doomed to failure. Proponents of incrementalism avoid the reality that special interests oppose many of their proposals anyway. And I think that's something that we really need to take into account, especially when we get like historical context like this. That like even though logically it makes sense, like okay, do smaller bite-sized reforms until you get the results that you want ultimately, and do it in a way that's more politically feasible and so on. But like when we look back at like those exact same attempts, because these arguments have been made before, we see how they turned out, like we see what the results were, like it's clear that that approach hasn't worked. um and the only reason why we'd be willing to make it the same like logical argument now is if we like just forego past experiences, right? Which is part of the reason why I was really happy to use like some older references here, because I think they mean much more now, as opposed to like sometimes information gets outdated. I think in this instance, like it's more beneficial that we have like really um we have evidence from the past that like we push now because the context is the same. And then past this argument being made here, there's two other things or sources that I found that I think are really interesting. So the first one is like a PowerPoint. Granted, like yeah, like it's a PowerPoint, but it's from by Margaret Flowers, MD, and it was presented in 2017. So this is much closer to like today's kind of political landscape. And there's a few things that she goes through here. Um, I'll upload the links in the description if you guys want to look through the whole thing. But there's a few arguments and discussions that are made here that I wanted to address. They go over like common themes that you hear in dissent. So like improve Medicare for all is too much to change at once. The opposition to improve Medicare for all is too strong. Loss aversion is a problem. We have to do what's politically feasible. And it kind of like addresses some of those accusations, gives like responses to how we handle those criticisms, right? So like here it is, like our responses. What really stood out to me was that she kind of discusses the incremental approaches and problems with them. Let me find let's see, right here. So like what is private health insurance? Commercial health insurance is defined as a financial service by the United States. And it kind of has like a chart of all the insurance companies and their stock prices, right? And like all of these are just sky high. Looking at how like they've been going up. The point here is that like the goal of an health insurance company is not to provide the best health coverage, right? The goal is to increase revenue and reduce cost, and those incentives clash, right? You can't provide people with the best healthcare while your incentive is to increase your revenue. Those two are conflicting, right? And that conflict of interest makes it so that like insurance companies have a really hard time doing a better job than government programs, because they have to try to either balance the two interests or commit to one or the other, right? Um, and I think this goes on to say there's a few important like notes being made. No more compromising. Um, Now is the time. The United States is currently spending twice as much healthcare per person per year as the average industrialized nation with universal healthcare, and yet we still have 27 million uninsured. We're wasting 600 billion each year in excess administrative cost, and so on. Like I don't think I need to make the case for why Medicare for all is good. I think like most people that are going to be watching this, like you guys would agree that like Medicare for all is good. The main thing is to address like the arguments of like why now is not the time, and if anyone like does have this approach to where Medicare for all isn't preferable to things like the public option, and that's like an important discussion, and I do recommend looking at this because it does give some good points on the subject. And then the last thing that I read, and I'll be honest, I didn't go through this entire paper, but it's incrementalism, ethical implications of policy choices. This is October 99. Like, um, so to like balance out, we had 08, we have 2017, and now we have 2000 or 1999. The historical range where we see this discussion happening, I think is kind of eye-opening, right? Like, the fact that we have been discussing something for so long but have not gotten anything done is another good case for why like we should at least attempt something different, even if it blows up in our faces. Like when we know that like what we've been doing so far hasn't worked, then it's time to try something new, right? It might be worse, right? Like it might end up with a worse result, but what we know for sure is that what we're doing now isn't working. Anyway, so on this, I only want to touch on like this very beginning part. So, our analysis of the ethics of incremental healthcare reform leads us to the following conclusions. First, unless those who currently benefit from public policies that subsidize the cost of health insurance are willing to forego those benefits, we are obligated as a matter of basic fairness to extend similar benefits to the currently uninsured. There is simply no acceptable moral justification for the state of affairs in which most Americans receive assistance from the federal government with the cost of their health insurance, but some do not. Right? The point that it's making here is that um, you can't have a system where there are uninsured people, right? So then it says that either you have to have no federal participation or you have to have federal participation across the board. That it's unethical for some people to have a program like Medicare and some people to not have that program. There can't be uninsured people, is basically what this first argument is. Second, any public policy intended to remedy the basic unfairness of the current system must ensure that all citizens receive equal treatment with respect to access to health insurance as a consequence. And this has to do like with a qualitative argument or like just quality of health insurance. The system that allows everyone to be insured can't do so at the cost of um, how good that insurance is or how much the quality of healthcare is being received by the people, right? So you can't have a disconnect between how good your healthcare is versus how many people you cover, right? And then there goes go third, and I think it makes four arguments. Um, but I mainly wanted to just mention those first two because I think they set up a really good framework for how we should think about this, right? Um, in a holistic view. So that's about it on what I wanted to say on the subject, guys. Let me open this back up. Um, Obviously, like this is the first video that I'm going to be uploading on the channel, so I don't know how I'm going to handle some like housekeeping issues with like descriptions and what I'll include in there, like how I can get this information to you guys. So obviously I'll have the links to all of these in there for you all to go look at. But as far as like this Word document, if you guys want me to include stuff like this, because I think it's good to have like the bite-sized information available to you. And if you notice like the way this is set up, like I've highlighted certain things and then the rest of the text is small, right? So that's another reason why I include like the links to everything, because I don't want it to appear to like I'm picking and choosing what I'm showing you. It's more like I'm highlighting what gets the message across, right? I don't want to like exclude contradictory information. Like if at the end of this like the author says something like, yeah, except like Medicare for all is bad. Like I can't just cut that out, like clearly. Um, so yeah, I hope you guys learned something. I hope this is useful. I hope you can take this information and like spread it and show it to somebody else. Clearly, like the channel is small. Like I don't think my opinion is what matters in this case. I think what really matters is the information presented and how we can like at least make a case for people to evaluate. It doesn't matter if someone agrees or disagrees with me here. It's more so matters that like this information is part of your decision making, right? That when you're deciding on whether you agree or disagree with forcing the vote, at the very least you're making an informed decision. So appreciate you guys watching. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that. Thank you and have a great night.